on violence in the international context. We have many times indicated in the preceding pages that in underdeveloped countries, the political leader is constantly calling on the people to fight. The fight against colonialism, to fight against poverty and underdevelopment, to fight against debilitating traditions. The vocabulary he uses is that of a chief of staff. Quote, mobilization of the masses, end quote. The agricultural front, the illiteracy front, defeats suffered, victories won, end quote. During its early years, the young independent nation evolves in the atmosphere of a battleground. This is because the political leader of an underdeveloped country is terror-stricken at the prospect of a long road that lies ahead. He appeals to the people and tells them, let us roll up our sleeves and get to work. Gripped in a kind of creative frenzy, the nation plunges into action of a hugely disproportionate nature. The agenda is not only to pull through, but to catch up with the other nations as best one can. There is a widespread belief that the European nations have reached their present stage of development as a result of their labors. Let us prove, therefore, to the world and ourselves that we are capable of the same achievements. Posing the problem of development of underdeveloped countries in this way seems to us to be neither right nor reasonable. Ugh, that's a confusing sounding sentence. But, the European nations achieved their national unity at a time when the national bourgeoisie had concentrated most of the wealth in their own hands. Shopkeepers and merchants, clerks and bankers monopolized finance, commerce, and science within the national framework. The bourgeoisie represented the most dynamic and prosperous class. Its rise to power enabled it to launch into operations of a crucial nature, such as industrialization, the development of communication, and eventually the quest for overseas outlets. In Europe, barring a few exceptions, England, for instance, had taken a slight lead. States achieving national unity were in roughly the same economic situation. Because of the nature of their development and progress, no nation really insulted the others. Today, national independence and nation building in the underdeveloped regions take on an entirely new aspect. In these regions, except for some remarkable achievements, every country suffers from the same lack of infrastructure. The masses battle with the same poverty, wrestle with the same age-old gestures, and delineate what we would call the geography of hunger with their shrunken bellies. A world of underdevelopment, a world of poverty and inhumanity, but also a world without doctors, without engineers, without administrators. Facing this world, the European nations wallow in the most ostentatious opulence. This European opulence is literally a scandal, for it was built on the backs of slaves, it fed on the blood of slaves, and owes its very existence to the soil and subsoil of the underdeveloped world. Europe's well-being and progress were built with the sweat and corpses of blacks, Arabs, Indians, and Asians. This we are determined never to forget. When a colonialist country, embarrassed by a colony's demands for independence, proclaims with the nationalist leaders in mind, quote, if you want independence, take it and return to the Dark Ages, end quote. The newly independent people nod their approval and take up the challenge. And what we actually see is the colonizer withdrawing his capital and technicians and encircling the young nation with an apparatus of economic pressure. 9. Alright, let's... I'm just gonna copy paste this. Why? Okay. Let's see. In the current international context, capitalism does not impose an economic blockade solely upon the colonies in Africa and Asia. The US, with its anti-Castro policy, has inaugurated in the Western Hemisphere a new chapter in the history of man's laborious fight for freedom. Sorry, it's 11:30 here. The U.S. inaugurated a laborious fight for freedom. Latin America, composed of independent countries sitting at the UN with their own national currency, should be a lesson for Africa. Since their liberation, these former colonies live in terror and destitution under Western capitalism's stranglehold. The liberation of Africa and the development of man's consciousness have enabled the peoples of Latin America to break the spiral of dictatorships, where one regime looked very much like the next. Castro takes power in Cuba and hands it to the people. The Yankees feel this heresy to be a national scourge, and the US organizes counter-revolutionary brigades, fabricates provisional government, burns the sugarcane harvests, and finally decides to place an implacable stranglehold on the Cuban people. It won't be easy, however. The Cuban people will suffer, but they will win in the end. Llanos Quadros, the president of Brazil, recently declared in a declaration of historical importance that this country will defend the Cuban Revolution by every means possible. Perhaps the US too will bow to the will of the people. That will be a day for rejoicing, since it will be a crucial moment for men and women throughout the world. The almighty power of the dollar, whose security, after all, is only guaranteed by the slaves of this world, toiling in the oil wells of the Middle East, the mines of Peru and the Congo, and the united fruit and firestone plantations, will then cease to dominate these slaves who created it, and who continue to drain their heads and bellies of all their substance to feed it. These are big notes. Can just be like, here's a little thing. The apotheosis of independence becomes the curse of independence. The sweeping powers of coercion of the colonial authorities condemn the young nation to regression. In other words, the colonial power says, if you want independence, take it and suffer the consequences. The nationalist leaders are then... The nationalist leaders then are left with no other choice but to turn to their people and ask them to make a gigantic effort. These famished individuals are required to undergo a regime of austerity. These atrophied muscles are required to work out of all proportion. An autarkic regime is established, and each state, with the pitiful resources at its disposal, endeavors to address the mounting national hunger and the growing national poverty. We are witness to the mobilization of people who now have to work themselves to exhaustion while a contemptuous and bloated Europe looks on. Other third world countries refuse to accept such an ordeal and agree to give in to terms of the former colonial power. Taking advantage of their strategic position in the Cold War struggle, these countries sign agreements and commit themselves. The formerly colonized territory is now turned into an economically dependent country. The former colonizer, which has kept intact and in some cases reinforced its colonial marketing channels, agrees to inject small doses into the independent nation's budget in order to sustain it. Now that the colonial countries have achieved their independence, the world is faced with the bare facts that makes the actual state of the liberated countries even more intolerable. The basic confrontation, which seemed to be colonialism versus anti-colonialism, indeed capitalism versus socialism, is already losing its importance. What matters today, the issue which blocks the horizon, is the need for a redistribution of wealth. Humanity will have to address this question no matter how devastating the consequences may be. I'm going to put a little note for that because... quote... I'll say... need for redistribution of wealth. This is more pertinent today. This is as pertinent today as it was then, if not more so. as more so. In the wake of what am I, Australian or something? In let's say in the face of mounting climate catastrophe. Jeez. Ooh, I have an idea. All right. Oh, I can just turn that off. Uh-oh. Let's log in with Google so it doesn't fucking show up. Log out. What the fuck? Log in with Google. Let's try this. Pencil. Log in with Google. Let's try that. What? How is it still? Ugh. Well, that's annoying. But whatever. Fine. Okay. Of course, the whatever is only in the premium version of this shit. Whatever. In the face of mounting climate catastrophe, and growing. Wait. We have to do no matter what the mounting climate catastrophe. In the face of mounting climate catastrophe and an ever-growing climate refugee crisis, the need for wealth redistribution, and as well as wealth redistribution and what's the other thing? Let's say degrowth, yeah. Seems, at least to me, more necessary now than it's ever been. Like the Green New Deal are a step in the right direction, but they need to also address the concerns and lives of the people the US affects around the world, not just in our country. if we things like the Green New Deal are a step in the right direction, but they need to also address the concerns and lives of the people the U.S. affects around the world, not just in our country. We don't want the crises to worsen. Degrowth is a necessary part of that as well, because, I mean, we need to reverse the consequences of current and previous consequences of the last 100 or so years of technological degrowth is a necessary part of this as well, because we need to reverse the consequences of the last 100 years or so of technological development that has an ecological destruction. I feel like I'm just like digging myself into a hole by writing this whole thing. Because we need to reverse the consequences of the last 100 years or so of technological development and ecological destruction. As best we can. Okay, let's continue on. Alright. It is commonly thought that the time had come for the world, and particularly for the Third World, to choose between the capitalist system and the socialist system. The underdeveloped countries which made use of the savage competition between the two systems in order to win their national liberation must, however, refuse to get involved in such rivalry. The Third World must not be content to define itself in relation to the values which preceded it. On the contrary, the underdeveloped countries must endeavor to focus on their very own values, as well as methods and style specific to them. The basic issue with which we are faced is not the unequivocal choice between socialism and capitalism, such as they have been defined by men from different continents and different periods of time. We know, of course, that the capitalist way of life is capable of allowing us to achieve our national and universal project. Capitalist exploitation, the cartels, and monopolies are the enemies of the underdeveloped countries. On the other hand, the choice of a socialist regime, of a regime entirely devoted to the people based on the principle that man is the most precious asset, will allow us to progress faster in greater harmony, consequently ruling out the possibility of a caricature of society where a privileged few hold the reins of political and economic power without a thought for the nation as a whole. Try socialist regime. But in order for the regime to function feasibly and for us to constantly abide by the principles... Sorry. Can feel myself slouching. Alright. But in order for this regime to function feasibly and for us to constantly abide by the principles which have been our inspiration, we need something other than human investment. Certain underdeveloped countries expend a huge amount of energy along these lines. Men and women, young and old, enthusiastically commit themselves to what amounts to forced labor and proclaim themselves slaves of the nation. This spirit of self-sacrifice and devotion to the common interest fosters a reassuring national morale, which restores man's confidence. Which restores man's confidence in the destiny of the world and disarms the most reticent of observers. We believe, however, that such an effort cannot be sustained for long at such an infernal pace. These young nations accepted to take up the challenge after the unconditional withdrawal of the God, that sounds so weird coming out of my mouth right now. Withdrawal of the colonizer. The country finds itself under new management, but in actual fact, everything has to be started over from scratch. Everything has to be rethought. The colonial system, in fact, was only interested in certain riches, certain natural resources to be exact, those that fueled its industries. Up till now, no reliable survey has been made of the soil or subsoil. As a result, the young, independent nation is obliged to keep the economic channels established by the colonial regime. It can, of course, export to other countries and other currency zones, but the basis of its exports remains basically unchanged. The colonial regime has hammered its channels into place, and the risk of not maintaining them would be catastrophic. Perhaps everything needs to be started over again. The type of exports need to be... Whatever. The type of exports... Sorry, I was having a grammar moment. The type of exports need to be changed. Okay, this is like a little much. Alright, we're changing this and turning the volume down a little bit. Really wish I could fucking not have this, but whatever. Not have the chat just be taken over by songs playing, but we'll figure that out. This is very much a work in progress, obviously. The colonial regime has hammered its channels into place, and the risk of not maintaining them would be catastrophic. Perhaps everything needs to be started over again. Type of exports needs to be changed, not just their destination. The soil needs researching as well as the subsoil, the rivers, and why not the sun? In order to do this, however, something other than human investment is needed. It requires capital, technicians, engineers, and mechanics, etc. Let us confess, we believe that the huge effort demanded of the people of the underdeveloped nations by their leaders will not produce the results expected. If working conditions are not modified, it will take centuries to humanize this world, which the imperialist forces have reduced to an animal level. Some countries, this is note 10, some countries which have benefited from a large European settlement acquire walls and avenues with their independence and tend to forget the poverty and starvation in the backcountry. In a kind of complicity of silence, by an irony of fate, they act as if their towns were contemporary with independence. Okay. The truth is, we must not accept such conditions. We must refuse outright the situation to which the West wants to condemn us. Colonialism and imperialism have not settled their debt to us once they have withdrawn their flag and their police force from our territories. For centuries, the capitalists have behaved like real war criminals in the underdeveloped world. Deportation, massacres, forced labor, and slavery were the primary methods used by capitalism to increase its gold and diamond reserves and establish its wealth and poverty and power. Wealth and power. Not so long ago, remember this was published in I think 1961, so Not so long ago, Nazism transformed the whole of Europe into a genuine colony. The governments of various European nations demanded reparations and the restitution in money and kind for their stolen treasures. As a result, cultural artifacts, paintings, sculptures, and stained glass windows were returned to their owners. In the aftermath of the war, the Europeans were adamant about one thing: Germany will pay. At the opening of the Eichmann trial, Dr. Adenauer, on behalf of the German people, once again asked forgiveness from the Jewish people. I think I said Dr. Adenauer. It's Mr. Adenauer. Mr. Adenauer renewed his country's commitment to continue paying enormous sums to the state of Israel to compensate for Nazi crimes. Note 11. Oh, Jesus. Another long note. I really don't want to fucking... bleh. And it is true that Germany has not paid in full the reparations for its war crimes. The compensation imposed on the conquered nations... Sorry, I got a tooth that's like rubbing the inside of my cheek, and it's fucking infuriating. And it is true that Germany has not paid in full the reparations for its war crimes. The compensation imposed on the conquered nation has not been claimed in full because the injured parties included Germany in their anti-communist defense system. The colonialist countries are motivated by the same concerns when they try to obtain military bases and enclaves from their former colonies, failing their integration into the system of the West. They've decided by common agreement to waive their claims in the name of NATO strategy, in the name of the free world, and we have seen Germany receive wave after wave of dollars and equipment. A strong and powerful Germany back on its feet was a necessity for the Western camp. It was clearly in the interests of a so-called free Europe to have a prosperous reconstructed Germany capable of serving as a bastion against the threatened Red Hordes. Germany has manipulated the European crisis. Consequently, the US and other European states feel legitimately bitter toward this Germany, once brought to its knees and now one of their most ruthless competitors on the market. Alright. At the same time, we are of the opinion that the imperialist states would be making a serious mistake and committing an unspeakable injustice if they were content to withdraw from our soil the military cohorts and the administrative and financial services whose job it was to prospect for, extract and ship our wealth to the metropolis. Moral reparation for national independence does not fool us. And it doesn't feed us. The wealth of the imperialist nations is also our wealth. At a universal level, such a statement in no way means we feel implicated in the technical feats or artistic creations of the West. In concrete terms, Europe has been bloated out of all proportion by the gold and raw materials from such colonial countries as Latin America, China, and Africa. Sorry. Today, Europe's tower of opulence and cotton, timber, and exotic produce to this very same... Today, Europe's tower of opulence faces these continents. For centuries, the point of departure of their shipments of diamonds, oil, silk, and cotton, timber, and exotic produce to this very same Europe. Europe is literally the creation of the third world. The riches which are choking it are also plundered from the underdeveloped peoples. The ports of Holland, the docks of Bordeaux, and Liverpool owe their importance to the trade and deportation of millions of slaves. And when we hear the head of a European nation declare with a hand on heart that he must come to the aid of the unfortunate peoples of the underdeveloped world, we do not tremble with gratitude. On the contrary, we say among ourselves, it is just a reparation we are getting. So we will not accept aid for the underdeveloped countries as charity. Such aid must be considered the final stage of a dual consciousness. The consciousness of the colonized that it is their due, and the consciousness of the capitalist powers that effectively they must pay up. If through lack of intelligence, not to mention ingratitude, the capitalist countries refuse to pay up, then the unrelenting dialectic of their own system would see to it that they are asphyxiated. It is a fact that the young nations attract little private capital. A number of reasons justify and explain these reservations on the part of the monopolies. As soon as the capitalists know, and they are obviously the first to know, that their government is preparing to decolonize, they hasten to withdraw all their capital from the colony. This spectacular flight of capital is one of the most constant phenomena of decolonization. Let me check something real quick. Alright, to make a radical distinction between the construction of socialism in Europe and, quote, relations with the third world, as if our only relations with it were external, is knowingly or unknowingly giving priority to restructuring the colonial heritage over the liberation of the underdeveloped countries. In other words, constructing a deluxe type of socialism on the fruits of imperial plunder. As if a gang were to share out the loot more or less equitably, even if it means giving a little to the poor by way of charity and forgetting they are giving back to the people they stole from. Marcel Pehu, Morir por Portugal? In Temps Moderne. Oh, sorry, I'm not saying that French. Marcel Peju in Montréal, Portugal. In Temps Moderne, number 175 to 176, October to November 1960. Okay. In order to invest in the independent countries... Jesus. Come on. Come on, me. Snap out of it. Do. Okay. Sorry, just catching up on some drama. Okay. In order to invest in the independent countries, private companies demand terms which from experience prove unacceptable or unfeasible. True to their principle of immediate returns, as soon as they invest overseas, capitalists are reluctant to invest in the long term. They are recalcitrant and often openly hostile to the so-called economic planning programs of the young regimes. At the most, they are willing to lend capital to the young nations on condition it is used to buy manufactured goods and machinery, and therefore keep the factories in the metropolis running. In fact, the Western financiers, whatever. The Western financiers are wary of any form of risk-taking. Their demands, therefore, are for political stability. Their demands, therefore, are for... Let's try that again. Their demands, therefore, are for political stability and a peaceful social climate, which are impossible to achieve given the appalling situation of the population as a whole in the aftermath of independence. In their search, then, for a guarantee which the former colony cannot vouch for, they demand that certain military bases be kept on and the young nation enter into military and economic agreements. The private companies put pressure on their own governments to ensure that the troops stationed in these countries are assigned to protecting their interests. As a last resort, these companies require the government to guarantee their investment in such and such an underdeveloped region. As a result, few countries meet the conditions required by the cartels and monopolies, so the capital, deprived of reliable outlets, remains blocked in Europe and frozen, especially as the capitalists refuse to invest in their own country. Returns in this case are in fact minimal, and the fiscal pressure disheartens the boldest. The situation in the long term is The situation in the long term is catastrophic. Can you tell I have not talked a whole lot today? The situation in the long term is catastrophic. Capital no longer circulates, or else is considerably reduced. The Swiss banks refuse funding, and Europe suffocates. Despite the enormous sums swallowed up by military expenditures, international capitalism is in desperate straits. But another danger looms on the horizon. Since the Third World is abandoned and condemned to regression, in any case stagnation, through the selfishness and immorality of the West, the underdeveloped peoples decide to establish a collective autarky. The industries of the West are rapidly deprived of their overseas outlets. Capital goods pile up in the warehouses of the European market, and the European market witnesses the inexorable rivalry between the financiers and cartels. Factory closures, layoffs, and unemployment force the European proletariat to engage in an open struggle with the capitalist regime. The monopolies then realize that their true interests lie in aiding without too many conditions the underdeveloped countries. It is clear, therefore, that the young nations of the Third World are wrong to grovel at the feet of the capitalist countries. We are powerful in our own right, and the justness of our position. It is our duty, however, to tell and explain to the capitalist countries that they are wrong to think the fundamental issue of our times is the war between the socialist regime and them. An end must be put to this Cold War that gets us nowhere. The nuclear arms race must be stopped, and the underdeveloped regions must receive generous investment and technical aid. The fate of the world depends on the response given to this question. And it is pointless for the capitalist regimes to try to implicate the socialist regimes in the fate of Europe confronted by the starving multitudes of colored peoples. Colonel Gagarin's exploit whatever General de Gaulle thinks is not a feat which does credit to Europe. For some time now, the leaders of the capitalist regimes and their intellectuals have had an ambivalent attitude towards the Soviet Union. After having joined forces to eliminate the socialist regime, they now realize they have to come to terms with it. So they switch on the smiles, multiply the overtures, and make constant reminders to the Soviet people that they are part of Europe. Okay. We're gonna have to look at that. They're having joined. It is pointless for the capitalist regimes to try and implicate the socialist regimes in the fate of Europe. Confronted by the starving multitudes of colored peoples, Colonel Gagarin's exploit, whatever General de Gaulle thinks, is not a feat which does credit to Europe. For some time now, the leaders of the capitalist regimes and their intellectuals have had an ambivalent attitude towards the Soviet Union. After having joined forces to eliminate the socialist regime, they now realize they have to come to terms with it. So they switch on the smiles, multiply the overtures, and make constant reminders to the Soviet people that they are part of Europe. Okay. That just took me a reread to figure that out. Uh, so I'm going to put a note to that. Um, the This was just we'll see. Um, is that it couldn't defeat the Soviet Union through current Cold War tactics, and so tried to cozy up to the USSR. Uh, on Russia being a part of Europe. Brandishing the Third World as a flood which threatens to engulf the whole Europe will not divide the progressive forces whose intentions are to lead humanity in the pursuit of happiness. The Third World has no intention of organizing a vast hunger crusade against Europe. What it does expect from those who have kept it in slavery for centuries is to help it rehabilitate man and ensure his triumph everywhere and once and for all. But it is obvious we are not so naive as to think this will be achieved with the cooperation and goodwill of the European governments. This colossal task, which consists of reintroducing man into the world, man in his totality, will be achieved with the crucial help of the European masses, who would do well to confess that they have often rallied behind the position of our common masters on colonial issues. In order to do this, the European masses must first of all decide to wake up, put on their thinking caps, and stop playing the irresponsible game of Sleeping Beauty. Oh, that's beautiful. That's wonderful. I love these fucking, old posters. Like, these dudes, these theorists were also like basically the posters of their time. So let's go 22 times 0 then 22. Okay, in order to do this European method, okay. So Fanon is talking about is talking about proletarian internationalism. The Third World basically can't he believes or recognizes that there is no way for the Third World to positively come out of the colonial struggle once and for all without the aid of the working, let's call them working classes of their colonizer countries. In order for all of us, let's say, in order for the Third World to prosper, it must link up with this let's say colonizer. The working classes of their colonizer countries. In other words, working classes, the people of Europe, must recognize their prior failings in siding with the colonizer, i.e. the government capital of their countries. Failings in siding with must recognize their prior failings in siding with the colonizer, i.e. the government capitalists of their countries. In other words, the word In other words, the working classes of colonizing countries, the people of Europe, must recognize their prior failings in siding with the colonizer, i.e. the government and capitalists of their countries, in order to free themselves. Let's see. Sorry. In other words, the working class of the people of Europe must recognize and come together with the peoples of the third world. If it's obviously we're not so naive to think this will be achieved with cooperation and goodwill of shut up. It is obvious we are not so naive as to think this will be achieved with cooperation and goodwill of the European governments. Will be achieved with the crucial help of European masses who would do well to confess that they have often rallied behind the position. Furthermore, in order for the working classes to achieve, maybe he's going to get to that next, but in order for the working classes to achieve their working classes of Europe to achieve their liberation. Furthermore, in order for the working classes of Europe to achieve their liberation, let's place to split this up at least. Maybe we'll keep going. Let's see how long this is. Grandeur and weakness and spontaneity. I think this one's fairly long. Yep. 48. 36. Let's see, what was the percentage on this? It's like small. Or 34, 36. So this is 36 to 48. Yeah, so this one's